Along these same lines, I would argue that I think we need to look seriously in the kind of area of new reforms that we need to consider. I think we need to look seriously at some of the class size sorts of restrictions that exist here in Florida. And I'm in some ways surprised to hear myself saying this, because like most people, I think my kind of knee-jerk reaction when I come to these sorts of questions is to say, hey, low student-teacher ratio is a good thing, more individualized attention, which is presumably what you would be getting, is a benefit, all the rest. But I had a really interesting experience about a year ago. My son and I were up in Boston on business, and while there decided to go and just visit Harvard and see what Harvard was like. And while we were there, we took the tour, and one of the things that we discovered, which kind of both left us, slack-jawed, was they have no class size requirements for their classes. That the students at the beginning of every semester have something that they call shopping week, where they go and shop to determine which classes they want to take. And if there's a class that they want to take that is currently slotted for 60 kids in the room, and more kids than the room that they have slotted for it want to take it, then they just find a bigger room. Now, I understand you can't easily do this in schools that have been designed with 30 kids or something like that in mind. But what was interesting about this is that basically what Harvard was saying was, we want the consumers to drive the decision making here rather than us. And we want to let them decide how they want to deal with that trade-off between size of class and quality of teacher. So you might have a large class with a renowned professor, or you might have a smaller class with someone who hasn't yet achieved that same level of pedigree. But you as the consumer get to make that sort of choice. And I thought, there's a lot of wisdom to this. And while we can't easily overnight kind of begin to transform things precisely that way, what it does show is something that we're seeing especially in the area of digital education, which is that a lot of times it is better to expose a kid to a great teacher in a larger classroom than to have them in a small classroom with a mediocre teacher. So I think class size might be something that we want to look at. So to sum here, I would say in the area of K through 12, we need to do more in the way of crowing about our success. We need to continue to place emphasis on excelling, however we may get there. And lastly, I want to say, I think we really need to spend as much time as we have been spending on staying on the cutting edge of innovation. One of the things about that whole experience that I had with my son and his baseball team and all these kids taking digital classes through the virtual school and all the rest, there was a part of me that was like, I'm not a techie by nature. I'm not someone who's naturally oriented toward online or virtual learning. There's a part of me that not only believes in the incarnation, but who believes that education, especially the transfer of wisdom, ought to be incarnational, ought to be person to person. But as I've looked at digital education and have seen the opportunities that it provides, I am convinced that there is an awful lot here that we need to take advantage of. Not as a complete replacement of in-person, sorts of styles of learning, but the nature of digital education is as Michael Horn has said, it is a disruptive innovation. It completely turns the kind of factory model of education that is based on an agrarian calendar on its head, and basically says you can learn anytime, anywhere, at any pace. And it puts emphasis on your mastery of the material before you advance, rather than how much time that you spend in a class soaking in the teacher's lecture or whatnot. And so one of the things that I think that Florida is on the cutting edge of, with its Florida Virtual School, it is a leader in this area, ought to remain so. And one of the things that's really exciting in this way is that we are already seeing innovations in their curriculum that is, I think, apt to draw more students and to make it, learning in this way even more appealing to certain disaffected students, perhaps especially boys. For example, Florida Virtual has now introduced a American history class In addition to their kind of usual American history course taught in the kind of usual way or usual content, they now have another option, if you want it, that's basically a video game version that's in many ways similar to a computer game that my kids used to always enjoy called Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego? And in this case, with U.S. history, they've kind of built in all these mysteries that you have to solve, and along the way, you learn American history. And I look at that and I think, good grief, you know, I wish I could go back to school and kind of do some of these things. And that is the very kind of thing that I think a lot of young disaffected students, perhaps especially males, might enjoy. So we've got work to do. There are reforms still needed. We've got to continue to press. But the K through 12 story is an increasingly good story for us, and we need to tell that to the wider world, to the wider country, because I believe that there are many people who would seriously consider coming and setting up businesses and starting a new life here in Florida if they knew just how good our schools were and just how innovative many of the options that exist here are. All right, let me spend a few minutes now turning our attention to higher ed, where I would say the news isn't all bad, but neither is it as rosy by any means as what we've considered with K through 12. If we are going to use, as we do in college football, as we have in K through 12, some sort of ranking systems or ranking services as a guide for measuring how we are doing, if you look at the most recent U.S. News and World Report rankings, Florida has but one institution of higher learning that is in the top 50. Only one in the top 20 among public universities. There are 9 schools in the state of California that rank ahead of our top public institution. And 6 of those are public institutions. Cal Berkeley, UCLA, UC Davis, UC Irvine, UC San Diego, UC Santa Barbara. I'm like, how does that happen? Kids get to go and study on the beach and they get a school that's ranked in the top 50? That shouldn't be. and yet our rankings are well behind. And that's not just true in the area of U.S. News, it's true in other ranking services like Washington Monthly. Or if you look, for example, at the AAU membership, Florida has but one member, University of Florida. Think about all of the other highly populated states, and here's the list. California, New York, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and get this, stinking Iowa. All have more than one member in the AAU. Now again, I realize that ranking services have their problems, that they aren't perfect, that there are problems and that there are extenuating circumstances and things that we could say about ourselves that would help make our case. But at a certain point, this is the way the system works, and a lot of the whining that we might do or the extenuating circumstances that we might appeal to are going to end up being about as interesting to most people as my daughter's complaints about Tim Tebow's robbing USC of the opportunity to play in national championships. She's convinced me. I believe that they got robbed. But, you know, that and 50 cents will buy us a cup of coffee, you know? And so at a certain level, yes, we don't need to bow our knee and worship at the altar of these ranking services, but we do need to recognize that they are things that people pay attention to, that they do affect decision making that people make about where they go to school, where they want to set up businesses, what kind of graduates they expect to come out. And so it is something that we need to pay attention to. Along these lines, there was a very interesting speech given the first day of the new session of the legislature this past January by House Speaker Dean Cannon, where he basically argued that we need to take a good long look at higher education, and said that in his mind, that the higher education system, in many ways, the analogy again that I would draw to football, is that all of us who have an interest in higher education in Florida are acting like the fans of a particular team, and that we need to be thinking increasingly about the fans of a particular conference. And if you look in a certain sense at the way the SEC has in some ways legitimately, in some ways I think illegitimately, kind of built up a reputation of being this kind of larger-than-life behemoth in college football. It is in large part because they have spent time and care building a conference brand and not just a brand for Alabama or for LSU or for Florida or whatnot. And that in a certain way, we need increasingly to work together in collaboration to raise the entire system of higher education in our state, rather than thinking of it as a competition between the partisans of UF or the partisans of UCF or USF or FSU or whatever it may be. In many ways, Dean Cannon's comments on this echoed a speech that was given last fall in Naples by the former Chancellor of Higher Education here in this state, Charles Reed, who is now the Chancellor in the higher ed system in the state of California. And he drew an interesting comparison and contrast between Florida and California. And while on most things, I would argue the last thing that the state of Florida ought to be doing is following or paying attention to what California does. Because the state of California is in all kinds of trouble in all sorts of ways. But in the area of higher ed, there probably are some things that we could learn from them. And some ways in which our system would be better served if it had the kind of internal coherence and strategizing that has been done there in California, so that everybody kind of understands how the system works. There is an easy transfer of students from one to another, and where instead of competing over certain prized programs, there is a recognition that it makes more sense to have, you know, a kind of division of labor, and not as, I mean, one of the things that Reed talked about is how in the last 15 years the number of medical schools here in the state of Florida has grown from 2 to 5, and that there ends up being an awful lot of duplication, and instead of excellence at those where a program is based, you instead run the risk of having a lot of mediocrity throughout. So, strategizing in the area of higher ed, pulling together a comprehensive plan that looks at what is best for the system, that seeks to build flagship institutions that are recognized as among the best of any in the country, and that in a certain sense pulls along with it others in the system, just as, you know, teams like Mississippi State in some ways get pulled into a higher level of recognition than they would otherwise if they weren't in the SEC. So let's build our conference, if you will, when it comes to higher ed.